Hello, everyone. I think we're about to begin. My name is Montana Stone, and I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Ecology, Evolutionary Biology, and I'm also a member of the Institute at Brown for Environment and Society's Graduate Student Seminar Committee, and I've had the pleasure of inviting today's speaker, Dr. Stephen Kress. Before we begin, I would like to thank my fellow graduate students and co-organizers, as well as IBIS staff and our faculty mentor, Dr. James Kellner, for making this event possible. Dr. Kress is an American ornithologist, conservationist, and educator best known for his pioneering work in seabird restoration. In the 1970s, he founded Project Puffin, successfully reintroducing Atlantic puffins to eastern Egg Rock off the coast of Maine, one of the first seabird restoration efforts of its kind. His innovative use of decoys and sound recordings to attract seabirds has since been adopted by conservation projects around the world. Dr. Kress received his PhD from Cornell University and his master's and undergraduate degrees from the Ohio State University. He also had a long-standing association with the National Audubon Society, where he served as the executive director of seabird conservation and later as vice president for bird conservation. Through his research, writing, including the book Project Puffin, The Improbable Quest to Bring a Beloved Seabird Back to Egg Rock, and hands-on conservation work, he has inspired generations to protect seabirds and coastal ecosystems. His work has been featured by the National Geographic Association, Smithsonian Magazine, and PBS. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Stephen Kress.
Can you hear that okay on the back? All right, that's terrific, thank you. So, Montana, thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you for the opportunity to be here and to tour the campus this afternoon. It's always a pleasure to have my wife in the audience, Alyssa Wolfson, over here. Yeah, and we're lucky to have my good friends Doug and Elsie Morse from this campus, and their daughter Julia with us tonight. So thank you all. Everybody that cares about puffins, make sure you find somebody else that cares after you leave here and share what you learn a bit from this experience. The amazing photographs and videos that I will be sharing come not just from myself, but from many other people from around the world who have collaborated with me. And that helps to make the Puffin story even more interesting. So this story about Project Puffin and saving seabirds has its origin in this beautiful island off the Maine coast. This is Hog Island, the Audubon camp in Maine, where I was invited in 1969 to come and teach adults about birds. And the birds that I met there, including this young black guillemot, were often novel to me because I grew up in central Ohio, and everything I was seeing along the Maine coast in those years was so new and surprising to me. Imagine a young biologist meeting black guillemots and being able to hold them for the first time. So that was kind of like the setting on this beautiful island. But this story really started in this building, which is a building called the Fish House on Hog Island, the Hog Island campus. In order to come up to speed to share what I knew about birds, I read everything I could in this building about the local birds. And of course, this book caught my eye, Maine Birds by Ralph Palmer. It was a species by species historic account of the birds, and it was all pretty straightforward. But at one point, I came across these words, that this island, not far from where I was reading about, the egg rocks, were once historic nesting places for puffins. I was shocked by that. I thought puffins only nested up in Canada, where I had seen them previously. And so this was amazing to me, that at one point, in the middle 1800s, there were considerable numbers not far away. So that was a first kind of like eye-opener that things had changed, and one's point of view was, not what it was, not even a short time ago. And because at Eastern Egg Rock, the puffins nested there until about 1860, they had disappeared because people were hunting them. Back in the day, they were hunting everything. And people were, probably the local people that were hunting puffins for meat and for the eggs and perhaps for feathers as well, all they knew was that there were some puffins to catch. They didn't have the larger picture and know that there were only puffins on about 5 or 6 islands on the whole Maine coast. And island by island, extinction, local extirpation was happening. Place by place, the birds were decimated. And all of this changed in the early 1900s when some people, women in particular, began to realize that killing birds to decorate their hats just made no sense at all. It is so severe that only one pair of puffins remained on the entire Maine coast by 1902. Other species like gannets and razorbills and murres were gone completely. Well, that changed by about 1916 when the Migratory Bird Treaty Act was passed. And that Migratory Bird Treaty Act remains one of the most important laws protecting seabirds. It's been weakened somewhat recently, but it still stands as the underpinning that makes hunting of all birds illegal, except for introduced species. So there was a time when all the birds were hunted for food and for feathers. And then there was a time when all of a sudden they were all protected. And so it was kind of a natural experiment to see which birds would repopulate islands naturally and which species wouldn't come back on their own. When I first got to Maine in 1969, the bird that had successfully responded to the lack of hunting most dramatically were the big gulls, herring gulls and great blackback gulls. They were everywhere. And I began to wonder, why is it that those birds were coming back, and why is it the puffins never came back, and other species were missing, like terns and razorbills? They were all missing. Well, these big gulls, it was pretty clear very soon, these big gulls were highly adaptive. And while they naturally eat herring, as the herring gull's name suggests, and they were still eating herring, but now as lobster bait being thrown off the back of boats. But they were also feeding on fish offal off commercial boats, and they were one by one eating garbage along the coast, either in bag by bag or in landfills. These scavenging type birds, and that would include crows and ravens as well, were thriving around people, especially when there was waste, human-produced waste. And meanwhile, the birds that didn't repopulate the coast were more of a specialist group. The puffins ate small living fish, terns likewise. And so birds that were able to eat anything, and birds that could double not only as scavengers but active predators like gulls definitely had the edge in the late 60s. So as a sort of a budding conservation biologist, I began trying to think, well, is there anything people can do about this? It was clear that by our lifestyle, we were influencing which species would be successful, and by just doing nothing, we were also not helping those that were not repopulating. It was a general thinking at that time to let nature take its course when it comes to still abundant birds. And all these species I just mentioned are native, abundant birds somewhere in their range. The general thought was that active intervention was typically inappropriate, and to save whatever conservation dollars there were for rare or endangered species. So even though puffins had been extirpated in Maine, they were still abundant in Iceland. Meanwhile, gulls were proliferating. Their lifestyle also helped them. They lay large clutches of eggs and they breed at a young age of only 2 or 3 years of age. And they don't migrate very far in the winter. Migration is a big risk for birds, and those that have long migrations generally are not as successful as those with short migrations like the gulls. So in the absence of doing nothing, these birds that were advantaged by human lifestyles were thriving. And they were not only thriving, they were excluding all these other species for naturally repopulating the islands. I didn't realize that at the time, but this advantage that the gulls had was so great that their sheer numbers were preventing any natural recolonization of more specialist birds like the puffins. So in that background scenario, what can you do? Well, some people were already sort of thinking that there is a place for people to do something. This was the early 70s. It was a time of great conservation victories in policy areas with the Endangered Species Act and these other acts that I've listed here. But it was also the time when there were bird conservation pioneers that were trying to help rare and endangered species. And you're looking here at 2 of those pioneers, both of which happened to be at Cornell University, where I began my graduate work in 1972. That's Tom Cade with a peregrine falcon on his hand. He single-handedly, a falconer, mobilized the falconer community to pioneer efforts to bring back the peregrine falcon to the eastern United States and later to the western states and later to other predatory birds as well. His graduate student, George Archibald, did the same thing for whooping cranes and many others. But at that period, they were only endangered species were benefiting from this way of thinking of intervening on behalf of these rare species. And it's an interesting anomaly that their success with those species over time has been so great that in some places, like the Maine coast, these once endangered birds are back in such numbers that they're now a conservation problem for the rarer species. This peregrine falcon, for example, is eating a migratory tern. And their populations have rapidly increased from the 1960s. And likewise, the bald eagle was almost gone from the state of Maine, and now it is back in increasingly great numbers. Here's a recent count showing bald eagle nests all over the state of Maine. There were only a few of them as recently as the 1960s. And where eagles run out of fish, which is often the case along the coast, they turn to birds. And so now the great blackback gull population is declining in Maine, as is the herring gull, because of the boon in bald eagles. Or one might say, well, that's just the balance of nature coming back, but the problem is that not only the gull population declining, but every other species of seabird is declining on the Maine coast, eider ducks and terns as well, because of eagles. So this throws out an interesting question in conservation biology. What does a good conservation biologist do when one endangered species is eating or creating a situation where other endangered species are threatened? And against that bird background, there's the mammals, often hard to see, often secretive, often nocturnal, but the mink population and the otter populations on the Maine coast are also booming. And these animals can become marine mammals and swimming out to islands, and they can devastate restored colonies as well. So against that background, I began thinking, well, maybe someone should do something for puffins, because in a lot of ways their story was like the extirpation of the eagle and the peregrine falcon and the ospreys. Humans had caused those birds to disappear. Perhaps somebody should try to help the puffins. And so I thought, who could possibly be against that? After all, look how cute they are, if nothing else. And I argued that from the beginning that puffins could serve as a model for other seabirds. because nobody had tried to help seabirds do a comeback. And that's when I met the naysayers who started asking questions like, well, why bother? Just go to Iceland if you'd like to see puffins. After all, there's millions still there. And then there were biologists that knew a lot more about puffins than I knew, who would just say, it plain won't work. They will go back to where they came from. You can't move them. You can't attract them. And after all, the best habitat is where the most puffins occur. And so that's where the puffins will go. And others would say, well, there's only so many conservation dollars. Let's put that at the most critical places, help the rarest species. And then there's those that said, well, that just sounds like you're playing God. It's not humans' job to do these kinds of things. Let the balance of nature return, and let those species thrive that can survive in the presence of what humans are doing. And it was a good thing for me that not every conservation biologist believed that. That there were some that said, you know, we can learn from this. And if we don't do something, then in fact, it'll be the gulls that'll be playing God, because the gulls will be making these decisions for us. Because after all, every species, they're not good, they're not bad, they're just trying to survive. Some of them, by chance, are just better at living in the wake of humanity. And so, with Bill Drury's help, I convinced the Canadians in 1973 to let me begin what became known as Project Puffin. But I really had to learn as much as I could about puffins in order to come up with a plan. And that plan sort of was based on a very, small amount of knowledge. There were huge gaps in what was known about puffins at the time. It was known that they breed on land for sure, but most of the year they were at sea, and nobody even knew where they went at sea. But what was known was they came back to land. They were very good at digging holes in the ground, throwing soil to dig a hole that might be as much as 8 feet underground, or nesting in rock crevices. It was known that they typically returned to that same nesting burrow year after year, that they typically have the same mate. That much was known. It was known that they lay one egg only, and they didn't lay it until for the first few years. It wasn't known at the time that, in fact, they don't lay their first egg till they're about 5 or 6 years of age earliest, and some not till 7 or 8. It wasn't known at the time that they can live now we know, some of them is into their 30s. It was known that they take turns incubating the egg. It wasn't known that the male does most of the nest attending and the female delivers most of the food. But now we know that the female brings back about 5 or 6 fish at a time for about 5 or 6 meals per day. And that the chick stays in the burrow. And the parent brings beak loads of fish and transfers these to the chick. It was thought at the time, before we got this inside views of what was going on inside of the burrow, that the parents just brought fish, dropped them on the floor of the burrow, and went back and out to sea to catch another beak load of fish. It wasn't known, in fact, that the parent puffin stays in the burrow, usually the father, most of the time. And that it's not just staying in the burrow, but it's actively engaged with the chick. It spends most of its time, the father does, preening the feathers of the little chick. And the little chick really enjoys this and makes contented peeping sounds. And even though the chick is almost as big as the parent, and here it's trying to get under the wing of its dad, way too big. It's like a big lapdog that doesn't know how big it really is. And the dad stays in the burrow, continues to preen the feathers of the chick. And this preening behavior helps to waterproof the feathers so that when the chick finally leaves, it's in good condition. We know now, too, that the dad has to stay in the burrow because other puffins are likely to show up and try and steal the burrow. And they may trample the chick, or they may take the egg and roll it out. These, what are called prospector puffins, intruder puffins. And we have viewed on these cameras huge fights between the nesting father and these intruding puffins. Who would know all of that? And then the chick comes out. It may see its parents for the last time, and then it will leave at night and paddle off into the sea, making a map as it goes of where home is, and somehow retrieving that map years later, spending the first 2 or 3 years floating on the water. And the chick eventually comes back and nests where it hatched. Well, that was pretty much what was known, and some of the things we've picked up since. And from that, I had to come up with a plan. And the Canadians helped me come up with this plan for the first few chicks. It was based on the idea that these chicks would hopefully come back to the release site rather than back to where they had hatched. And the plan, in short, was this. We got permission to fly to Canada and to a seabird nesting island called Great Island, which had about 160,000 pairs of puffins. With special carrying cases, we were able to collect 6 puffin chicks that first year and to fly them back in a small private plane back to the coast of Maine, and where we would hand rear them. At this stage, the chicks had not been out of their burrows in Newfoundland. They had not seen it, and it was a gamble that they would in fact learn this ability to return home sometime after this age. They were taken to Eastern Egg Rock, one of the 2 historic sites near the Hog Island Audubon camp. That first year, we were able to rear and release 5 of the chicks on Hog Island, but unfortunately a raccoon ate one of those 6 precious chicks. If it had eaten all of them, it would have been the end of the project, and I wouldn't be here today, I can tell you. There were many turning points in this project where it was very tenuous, many things that could have gone wrong along the way. But we were able to release those first 5 chicks on Egg Rock, knowing that we couldn't rear them on Hog Island. They had to go back to the place where they historically bred. And we figured that, too, they would have a better chance of learning the locations. It's still not known exactly how puffins figure this out. It's probably memorizing the Earth's magnetic field at that location. But how they store that and how they retrieve that years later is still a mystery. Following year, we got permission to move 50 chicks from Newfoundland and had larger cases. And they were taken on a small plane. That year, they were reared on Eastern Egg Rock. This is a treeless island. And living on a little remote island that's salt sprayed, almost washed over during the summer. But yet the historic home of puffins was no easy trick. This was before there were even flip phones. There were no cell phones. There were no laptops, no GPSs for navigation. There was no solar panels. Everything had to be carried on and off this rocky coast. And you can see the white water. There's no easy landings on this rock. Hardy young biologists were found to live in the tent, to survive on a diet mostly of peanut butter and jelly, because a small budget, you can imagine, was all we had. Those chicks were transferred the same day they were collected in Newfoundland into new homes, sod burrows. And I could probably spend all my time just talking about the development of a good burrow for a puffin chick. It wasn't easy. It went through many steps. But we eventually came to this idea of collecting sod on the island, building sod to keep the chicks cool, to permit rain to run through the burrow, so that the chicks were not either flooded or overheated in their burrows. Frozen fish had to be supplemented with vitamins. But because nobody had done this before, we didn't even know what kind of vitamins. We were kind of learning from zoo people at this stage as to what we should do. But the puffin chicks were so hardy, they came out, they exercised outside their burrows, and eventually they walked down to the sea at night, and they swam out alone. There was nothing more we could do at that point but wait. And so we waited. Years went by, actually, with none of them coming back. About 4 years went by, and every year we'd bring more and more birds from Newfoundland. By 1977, we had moved about 400 chicks from Newfoundland to eastern Egg Rock, and none of them had come back. And all those naysayers that were out there quieted for a while, but now we're really making a lot of noise that this was a publicity stunt and it was a waste of money and we were playing God and all the things that we were hoping not to do because nothing came back. And so sort of against the wall at that point, we had to try to do something different. And so we came up with the idea of putting up decoys to attract back our birds. We know they would be our birds because they would have bands on their feet. So we put up a wooden decoy in 1977, hand-carved on a rock. And this is one of the most amazing parts of this story because as soon as that decoy went up, a puffin showed up within days. And it walked up to the decoy, and I was fortunate to be able to be there when it came back. I saw this, I snuck up on the bird, took photos of the puffin. It was carrying a leg band, proving that it was one of our chicks. So that we finally had something to say to the naysayers. Look, this is working. And, and although some would say, oh, they would have come back anyways, they didn't. 100 years had passed before that first puffin came and landed. And so we were proud of that. And we put up more decoys. And usually, and you might think, well, how stupid could these birds be to see that decoy? But I can tell you this is one of the first experiences I had. They're not stupid at all. They quickly learned this. But they learn they're not real puffins. And yet there are some of them that, for whatever reason, don't figure it out so quickly. And I have this, which is more the exception than the rule, but it's worth watching. This, what's called head flicking behavior, is a look at me behavior. It's a courtship behavior. If that decoy was a real puffin, it would signal back in a similar way, and that would lead to building. This is a very persistent puffin. That bird, I would guess, has been at sea for about 2 to 3 years without seeing any other puffins, and it's really hopeful. We also put up mirrors to provide a more animated response, because I hope that this would hold the attention of the puffins. All along, the whole idea was to keep the puffins at Egg Rock long enough that other puffins would show up that they could interact with. And that's in fact what happened. The combination of the decoys and the mirrors became little hubs that were attractive to the puffins. Most of the puffins quickly learned this was not the real thing, but in the process, other puffins were landing at the same spot, and they were more attracted to each other. These days, puffins, decoys, and mirrors are not necessary anymore because the real puffins attract each other. But this was the moment we were waiting for, and it had to wait several more years. Remember, 1977 is when the decoys started working, but it wasn't until 1981 that we finally found a puffin carrying fish. Flying in with a fish, going under the boulders, coming out with a fish. That means there's a chick. And so we finally had a chick produced on the island. This was after about 100 years of waiting. Encouraged by all that, we took our puffin restoration program to Seal Island in Penobscot Bay, a historic site. where puffins used to breed but had not bred. A very similar story to Egg Rock. We built a little cabin to shelter the researchers. We hand-fed here 200 puffin chicks at a year. We were really confident in our chick rearing behavior. 200 a year. At the end of all the chick rearing, we had fledged about 1,000 chicks from Egg Rock and an additional 1,000 at Seal Island. And most of them, headed to sea. But we still didn't know where they went. And that's why the development of little tags, like these geolocator tags, was so useful. These little tags give you a rough estimate of location by they have a built-in clock, and they follow the sunrise and sunset, and they give you an estimate within a few miles of where the bird is actually at. The problem is you have to catch the bird, take off the tag, and you have to then download that precious information. And these are some of the tags that were recovered, and it was from those tags that it was discovered that some of those puffins were staying not far from where we are right now, off of the tip of Cape Cod, on the continental shelf, at an area that came to be known as the Northeast Canyons and Seamounts Marine Monument. And that was protected by President Obama. This chart, or this map, will show you the movement of two puffins, one of which is more of a homebody that just goes out to sea, and the other one goes all the way to Canada. There they go. Watch fast now. They're not flying that fast, by the way. But the blue one is the roamer. They mix out there briefly, at the edge of the continental shelf, and then back to the Maine coast by April. In case you missed it, I'm going to do it again. All the way to Newfoundland, that bluebird went. Northern Newfoundland. And then back to the Gulf of Maine. That's the time, the month. And then back to the nesting islands at Seal Island. I think the message from this is that not all birds do the same thing. Often when we think about where do birds go in the winter, we think, oh, we got it. They go here or they go there. But there's a lot of variation. Each bird is figuring it out. But we know from following the same bird in more than 1 year that blue bird, that blue patterned bird, will fly all the way to Newfoundland the next year as well. And the red bird will repeat that pattern. Most of them do the pattern of the red pattern. And now the devices are much more accurate. They're using GPS now to not only track the winter range, but the summer feeding areas. Birds tracked from Matinicus Rock, where there's a small colony, go out about 20 miles. So they're to catch a beak load of fish, some of them. So they're flying almost 40 miles to catch one beak load of fish. This information is important because there were plans to put in wind power along the Maine coast, and trying to make sure that it's not put in the middle of critical feeding areas is one of the goals, and that is a good use of this information. One of the challenges that I faced all along with this project was to try to answer this question about sustainability. Is there ever a time when you can walk away and call the job done? The puffins have come back to Egg Rock, but is there a time when people can leave and feel confident that the birds will be able to stay there? I'm going to return to that idea, but I want to show you one idea that I had that was started with that intent. That was to try to restore not just a puffin, but another species that often nests with puffins, and this is the Arctic tern. Arctic terns are famed for having the longest migration of any bird in the world, and there's a population in Maine that usually nests on the same islands with puffins. They nest on the surface of the ground, unlike the puffins. And here's a parent feeding a little chick. And because they're on the surface, they're very vulnerable to predators. And adult terns, unlike puffins, are so aggressive that they will chase away any predator that gets near their chicks. They'll chase away gulls. They'll even chase away eagles. So my thought was, well, that's what's missing here. This is the answer to sustainability. If I could just figure out how to bring the terns back, they would be like a protective umbrella. And we'd be done. We'd move on to saving some other rare species, and the puffins would be safe. And that led us to trying to use this decoy idea, which was promising with the puffins, for terns. So decoys of terns were made, and recordings were played. And this led to the development of a method that's now called social attraction. I would say it's probably the most useful thing that we've come up with yet, because it has broad application. It's the idea that a decoy, even an unrealistic decoy, can be attractive to birds, at least initially. And while the bird certainly knows this is not the real deal, it will land there. And if it lands there and stays there, it may find, another tern of its own species, and they will pair up. And this has proved itself time and again. The terns come back, and here's one laying eggs just inches away from a decoy. They're attracted, but they're not repelled by the decoys. And when you do this, you find that you can put out a common tern decoy and attract Arctic terns and even roseate terns, which is a federally endangered tern that nests on the Maine coast. So helping one species is helping multiple species. And we've continued to do this all along the coast. All these red spots are locations of summer field stations where college-age students, most from the U.S., but increasingly so from around the world, come to learn the methods of social attraction and island seabird management. Tent field camps, small cabins on remote treeless islands. And living on these islands is a joy in many ways, but it's also not easy because of the exposure and the constant attacks, because remember, these terns are aggressive to not just predators, but to people as well. And what's the outcome of all this? Decades of this kind of work? Well, the common terns are doing really well. This is a population growth by our biologists that live on the islands, except during a couple years of the COVID period. And with the common terns, their population's gone up by 63% since the early 2007. In contrast, the Arctic tern population has been slowly getting smaller and smaller. So it's important to know what's with the Arctic terns. We've used the geolocators and now GPS to learn about their migration. You can see eastern egg rock up at the top where these geolocators were placed. And notice each of these lines represents a different tern. And how, again, each one is taking a different route. There's many ways to get to the Weddell Sea where they all want to go in the winter. That's that bottom cluster. Some of them go all the way into the Indian Ocean. Others go via Africa. Others go via South America. This enormous migration route. And there are places along the way, stopping stations, where they spend a lot of time. Places that are as important to protect as are the nesting islands. The GPS tagging system shows us an even more precise. These are two different terns. A blue line represents one pattern. Notice it went to South Africa and then comes around to the Weddell Sea, where it meets the red bird that went via Argentina. They overlap. Whether they recognize each other, who knows? But notice in the spring, they're in a rush to get back home. They go home much faster than they did in the spring, in the fall migration. It really takes the whole Atlantic Ocean to provide habitat for these terns. And this map, more than any other migration map I know, shows how important it is international conservation. And it helps us to understand perhaps why the Maine tern population is slowly declining, because conditions are degrading in a number of places, especially in Antarctica. where the ice is melting, and there's a lot of competition for krill now. Well, here's another map, a very positive map in my view, because this map shows the locations of restoration sites around the world where seabirds are increasing because of these methods that were developed first at Eastern Egg Rock. About 130 species now. About a third of all the seabirds in the world have benefited from social attraction, that quick response method. And a biologist has to make a decision about whether you translocate chicks and then maybe they'll come back after 8 years, or do you put out decoys and they come back the same year? They're choosing, of course, the social attraction. It doesn't work for all species, but it's worked for many. Let me show you just a few of those exciting success stories. This is a sad-looking murre that tangled with the Apex Houston oil spill off of California. This was once a thriving nesting colony off of San Francisco. This is what it looked like before the oil spill, where murres would come and raise their little chicks. This is what it looked like after the spill, and this is how it looked for about 10 years. Biologists, funded by money from the oil spill, were hired. They had to be very capable, both mountain climbers and boatmen, as well as seabird biologists, climb this slope, put up decoys, and the decoys attracted murres immediately, just like the puffins did. And here's a slide that shows Devil's Slide Rock before the oil spill in 1979, and now, how it looks now. You really can't tell the difference. And in this case, we've taken off all the decoys, and there are no predator problems to speak of, and the population seems to be sustainable. Hopefully there won't be another oil spill. Of course, there could be. Another project in Japan works with the beautiful short-tailed albatross. The short-tailed albatrosses presently nest on just 3 islands. Almost all of them nest on Torishima Island, where there was a huge slaughter in the early 1900s for feathers to stuff mattresses. Unfortunately, that island is an active volcano that could erupt at any time, and that's where they all nest. And that's why biologists are trying to attract them now to non-volcanic islands using decoys. And translocating chicks. Here's 2 biologists hand-feeding a short-tailed albatross chick. It takes 2 people to feed one small fish to one albatross chick. Is all that effort worth it? Of course it's worth it, because otherwise the species could go extinct. This idea of using decoys has become increasingly popular. We produce them on the Maine coast. This is Sue Schubel, who's making polyethylene eggs from recycled polyethylene, milk jug plastic, and those are shipped around the world, including to China. These are 2 Chinese biologists working with the critically endangered Chinese crested tern. This tern was thought to be extinct for 70 years. They look almost like the great crested tern, except they have orange beaks with black tips. Can you find any in this picture? There's several. And the decoy is shown off with the arrow. This is a decoy. This is a live one. And watch the interaction here, because that Chinese crested tern really likes that decoy. It's actually ignoring another Chinese crested tern over here. But the good news is that they eventually found each other, and there's the little chick. So this project is just another example of the export of an idea. It was a long shot idea, the other side of the world, and I've been fortunate to travel there and actually work with these biologists, helping the Chinese crested tern, which now nests on several islands in South Korea and also in China. So how are the puffins doing after all this? Well, at Eastern Egg Rock, the population has grown slowly over the first 20 years from when they first nested. There was a dip in the population about 2013, and our last good count a few years ago was 188. There's probably about 200 pairs there now. The Seal Island project reached 674 pairs in 2024. That population seems to be stable or slowly increasing. And that was the stuff of 2 books, if you want to know more about this project, these 2 books. In detail, the white one, for an early reader version, the Puffin Plan. The biggest issue that I think puffins face, perhaps all species face on this planet, is our warming oceans, our warming lands. Climate change is tough for a seabird that lives in cold water. This is a graph of global warming of the oceans and warming of the Gulf of Maine. You can see it's warming faster than the world's oceans. And that's because of the way the currents are off the coast of Maine. The blue line is the cold water from the north, and when that flow is less than it normally is, the Gulf Stream slips into the Gulf of Maine and warms it up with heat waves. And the response of the birds, like the puffins, is based on the response of the fish. The fish are shifting north. Most species of cold water fish are moving north. Their ranges, they just move north to find the cold water, or they move deeper, or they move further offshore. But the puffins are limited. They're limited to how far they can fly to catch a good meal of cold water fish. Remember, they can only fly about 20 miles. Costs too much energy otherwise. And they can only dive to about 50 feet. So if the fish is moving more than about 50 feet, it's out of range for puffins. They're great divers, but there's limits. And the effect of this on puffins shows this kind of a pattern. This is both Matinicus Rock and Seal Island. Ups and downs together. When the heat waves come, the population productivity of chicks is less in a dramatic way. In some years, much more. There's that 2012 dip. We're to learn about this these days by the biologists that continue to live on the island. They spend a good part of the day, usually about 6 hours a day, in observation blinds. And then they take that data back to our little cabin and they summarize the data to get long-term pictures of what's going on. And one thing we're learning is the fish population's changed a lot. Herring is almost gone from the diet of puffins on the Maine coast. It's too bad. That was a very perfect fish. It was the right size, it was the right nutrition. They could bring back 5 or 6 of these. It was a terrific meal. Their other important food, the white hake, is also shifting too far from the islands. Well, that's not good news for this story. But here's something to think about. There are other fish that are moving northward from the south. Being at the edge of the range, there are both the cold water fish and there are new fish that are shifting northward into the Puffin's range. So who are some of these candidates? One of them is the butterfish. And here's a view inside of the puffin burrow of a baby puffin eating a butterfish when its parent brings back an even bigger butterfish. This fish, although it has good nutrition, is too broad. The chicks have a hard time swallowing it. So this is not a good news substitute at all for the little chicks. Bigger chicks, however, we've learned can swallow them. In fact, some of the bigger chicks can even peck them apart and eat them bit by bit. There's other fish that are showing up that are a better fit for puffins. One of them is the haddock. It's not quite as fat-rich as a herring, but there's plenty of it. And that fish is a result of good fisheries management. So this is the interface of good fisheries management and seabird conservation. If we're not overexploiting the fisheries, and we're leaving plenty of fish for people, we're also leaving plenty of fish for seabirds. Haddock is now common on menus in New England. Think fish sticks and fish fries. But it's also in the diet. Here's another new of puffins. Here's another new food showing up, the Atlantic sorry. It's just the right width, but it's a little long. And here's a chick that's eating a sorry, and this is a good example of a puffin chick that is going to have a good meal if he just sticks with it. When you're in a puffin burrow, what have you got to do except to eat the fish and take your time at it? Notice it's broken this fish in half. So I see this as an adaptation to the birds learning how to make good use of a novel food. And it just got a very good meal there. And now it's going back for the second half. It's hard to believe that whole fish is going to fit in that puffin, but it does. Again, how long are we going to have to be out on these islands? How long are we going to have to protect them in this way? We know one thing for sure, that's the birds don't read signs. The gulls, the eagles, the mink, they're going to come out because they will know there's food. And if we do nothing, they probably will have the last hour. When we pack up the researchers and they leave our field station on Egg Rock, almost to the day, the eagles show up and they take over the cabin. Well, a few years ago, I tried a novel project. I got some high school students to help me build a robot, thinking that a robot person might help protect the puffins. We wouldn't even have to be there. So with the help of a Cornell robotics person, we came up with what we call Robo Ranger. And the idea was that this would pop up randomly, and that if the researchers were to dress up like the robot, maybe the birds would learn that to stay away from islands with the robot. Well, you can probably guess, I wish I had guessed this at the time, how this would unfold. The birds quickly started perching on its head, the predators, the gulls, quick to learn. And it was just a good example of a sort of a humble pill that we can't read. There's no easy exit plan to this kind of protection. These are conservation-reliant species, the puffins and terns. Having people with some ongoing presence is going to be important. And the value now that I see, in addition to bringing the birds back and keeping them there, is to train a whole new generation of conservation biologists to help be stewards of birds like puffins and life on Earth. That's an exhilarating experience to be part of a successful long-term program. It takes lots of people. And because puffins are so far away, there's got to be an education part of this as well to get more people to care. That's where the cameras watching puffins inside their burrows come in, and cameras watching puffins on board. And ecotourism, boats that go around the island. Some of the money from this tourism goes to pay for the summer salaries of the researchers on the islands. They don't land on the island, they don't really bother the birds. The puffins have gotten accustomed to these tour boats. And educating the local kids, the children of lobster fishers and those that live along the coast is important too, to realize that people are part of the web of life. In this exercise, if one person pulls on a string, everybody in the group feels it, because people are part of that system. Everything is connected. That was a lesson that I learned at Egg Rock, and I taught at Hog Island. Well, there are a few take-home messages after doing this for now more than 50 years, is that these conservation-reliant species are only going to be there if we take an active role. And it's not just these few species, but everywhere. More and more species around the world are dependent upon people because people's actions are everywhere. And doing nothing has consequences. A reminder that nature is very complex, and all these parts are connected. And we're in the middle of it. And yet, with ample talent and persistence and patience, people can bring back these species. We need to think about animals and their amazing sense of talents and how they sense the world, because we are a part of that same world they share, and to stay humble that all these animals can do things and see things and feel things that we cannot. So with that, a few lessons to think about, and it's been a real pleasure to share this Puffin story. Thank you. So, do we have time for a few questions? Okay. Happy to answer any questions, yes.
Do they feed on sand eels?
The question is, do the puffins feed on sand eels? In Maine, they do some years. That's another new species that's moving into the range. And when it's a sand hills summer, or a sand eel summer, it's a great summer for puffins and terns. Yes?
So thank you for all of your work and for a very inspirational story and talk and for everything you've done.
Okay.
I'm sorry if I missed this in the beginning, but eagles and mink and gulls were around long before humans excavated puffins from the island. So presumably there's some equilibrium that would be established. And so I'm curious, like you say they're conservation reliant at the scale of that island. But do you think that, like, I don't know, it seems like they all managed to work it out before.
Okay.
So I'm curious.
Yeah, this is a good question, I think, because it makes you wonder, how is it that all these the puffins and terns and eagles and mink, how did they all get along before humans were there? Okay, well, they probably did, and I think that the biggest change that I see is that it's simplistic to think that everything is the same underwater as we see it above. I think the marine ecosystem on the bottom, from the bottom up, has also been changing. And the biggest thing that's different is the absence of a lot of fish inshore. Almost all the rivers in Maine and all the tributaries to the rivers have been blocked with dams. The migratory herring that used to go up the rivers are essentially gone. A few encouraging restoration stories with alewives, yes, but first of all those are gone. And those used to feed a lot of big fish that would come in shore. I mean, they used to be able to catch cod in the inshore waters. Now there's hardly any cod left, for example, and halibut and other big fish that would feed on all this missing forage fish. So what's an eagle to do? Back in those days, eagles loved to eat fish. They would much prefer fish. Inland Maine, they feed mostly on fish. On the coast, there aren't a lot of big fish. Folk have a hard time catching much. And so I think the difference is that back in the day, we like to think of, the pre-colonial period at least, there was a lot more fish before we dammed the rivers and overfished all the fisheries. And that's what the eagles were eating. That's what the mink were eating. And it was a whole different system. Today we're looking at an impaired system, diminished system. Yes?
I was wondering, for the birds that were transferred to the main islands, did you see, I mean, they were raised by humans, so did you see any behavioral changes as those chicks were reared and grew up? I was thinking about the preening from the father,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
did you experience that?
Okay, so your question is, how is it that these hand-reared chicks, how could they survive? Well, they seem to have a lot of innate behavior, instinctive behavior. And although the parents do preen them, that's apparently not critical, because we didn't preen them. And we were worried, we worried about a lot of things, that they would get imprinted and they would come back and they would be attracted to people. Maybe they would land on lobster fishing boats and think that they could get a meal or something. You hear about these things, but no, they never did. So we were lucky in that respect. So some of those changes were not abnormal. That said, in general, we had only about 20% of our chicks ever sighted again. I don't think the survival was as great as chicks reared in the wild are. So being reared by your parents probably does have advantages and a higher success rate.
Have you
Yeah.
that were born and raised on islands.
So the question is inbreeding an issue? I worried about that one too, because I had this idea that the puffins released from egg rock would come back to egg rock, and we'd end up with all them sort of breeding together. In fact, the puffins that we fledged from egg rock didn't all come back to egg rock. Some did. Some were truly followed that pattern. Others went over to Matinicus Rock and joined that little colony. Others went to Machias Seal on the Canadian border. And some of the birds from Machias Seal came all the way down to eastern egg rock. So native puffins were from local colonies, and there were two colonies, Matinicus Rock and Machias Seal, ended up interbreeding with our translocated puffins. So interbreeding, I don't think was a problem. Time for another question? Okay.
Are they limited by sea temperatures to be able to come south if they would, or are they limited by food resources? To expand the colony.
Yeah. So,
outside of the-
okay. So your question is, what limits the southern range
Yeah.
of the birds? Probably a variety of things. Nesting islands need to be, nesting habitat has to be just right. Rock crevices, the geology doesn't really favor puffins south of mid-coast Maine. But water temperature probably is a factor. And that affects everything from the plankton up top. There are cold water plankton that feed the cold water fish. And so there's a number of species that sort of stop at the Muscongas Bay where eastern egg rock is. The cold water birds, the Arctic terns, the puffins, the black guillemots, the common eiders, leeches, storm petrels. These are all cold water birds. So I think that there is a water association related to the food chain. But it's also, for puffins, it's nesting habitat as well. There's another question.
I know that rodent introduction is a big issue in a lot of seabird nesting colonies in other areas. Has that been a problem off the coast of Maine?
So the question is, are introduced rodents a problem? It is a big problem, maybe one of the biggest island management problems worldwide. Fortunately in Maine, no, we never ran into a problem of rats on islands. That would be the rodent that I would worry most about.
Did you make an effort to, when landing on the island throughout the years, to try and make sure there were no rodents on the boat?
Yes, we have. We try to make sure we're not transporting mammals out to islands. Yeah. Okay.
Has the avian flu virus had an impact on the coastal seabirds?
The question is, what about avian flu? Avian flu has been detected in Maine, and it has been found in tern colonies in Maine, but not in puffin colonies so far. Puffins, maybe because they nest isolated in different burrows, they're not shoulder to shoulder like terns and other birds like gannets that are vulnerable. So far, knock on wood, we haven't had that in puffins. But yeah, that was part of the reason that I explained from the beginning, justifying this project. All the eggs were literally in one basket when it came to puffins in Maine. They were all on Matinicus Rock. Spreading the risk out to other islands just makes good common sense in the case of an epidemic or a predator. So I think with that, we're going to stop and thank you all very much.